You're listening to Radio Islam International. Up next, the Middle East report, and we are joined by James M. Dorsey, an award-winning scholar and journalist. Different perspective on the Middle East and a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Singapore. You can follow James, of course, and his writings and his ideas if you subscribe to James' newsletter/blog, The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer. That's what you're looking for. Or you can check out some of James Dorsey's articles, www.jamesmdorsey, that's a one-word.net. A good day to you, James.
Good morning, and pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. James, as expected, the discussion coming out of the Middle East, Gaza, and when is this ceasefire going to be? When is this prisoner exchange, going to happen? We're already approaching the mid-half of the month of Ramadan. Many had thought that this, would at least, the ceasefire, that is, would begin the beginning of Ramadan. Not to be exactly, although there are reports of a lull in actual fighting itself, not in the humanitarian crises, but buried in the reporting that negotiations may produce a Gaza ceasefire and prisoner exchange is a Hamas concession to initially accept a temporary rather than a permanent ceasefire. I know Hamas wanted a permanent ceasefire, but they may be pressed to accept a temporary one. Your reading on that, James?
Well, if you and I knew the answer to your question, we wouldn't be talking about this here. It's a $64,000 question. What's key here is the fundamental gap between Hamas and Israel on what a ceasefire would represent. With other words, would this be a permanent ceasefire, or would this be a temporary ceasefire? What seems to be an important move, even though we're still not close to a ceasefire, is the fact that Hamas, at least at this stage, may have surrendered its demand that any ceasefire has to be permanent, and that it may have accepted the notion of a 6-week ceasefire in which some of the Hamas-held hostages would be exchanged for Palestinians held in Israeli prisons, and that would create space for a negotiation about a permanent ceasefire. One reason why Hamas may have, or two reasons why Hamas may have been willing to make that concession, is that on the one hand, you have now a U.S. proposal for a Security Council resolution that calls for a sustained and immediate ceasefire. It doesn't use the word permanent, but a sustained ceasefire essentially means a permanent ceasefire. The second reason why Hamas may be more conciliatory is that it is under pressure from Qatar, which on its part is under pressure from the United States. And Qatar may have been, or has indicated to Hamas leaders that they could lose their residency and their base in Doha if they don't prove to be cooperative in the ceasefire negotiations.
Moving on to the Israeli ground offensive, especially in Rafah. Now, there have been talks for a while now that it may be more playing politics than actually military, a military necessity, that Israel has to, do a ground offensive in Rafah, which many countries have warned them against. And, of course, the UN for that matter. Is that the case? I mean, especially for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that he would rather play politics of a ground offensive in Rafah than what actually might be militarily necessary?
I think it may be both. Netanyahu has, in the last 24 hours, indicated that a military offensive, a ground offensive in Rafah, was not imminent, that it would take some time for Israel to prepare for such an offensive. Now, what that means is that Netanyahu is bowing to U.S. pressure. If you look at statements by the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in the last 24 to 48 hours, on his tour to the Middle East, he has been more explicit than ever, frankly, in saying there cannot be a ground offensive in Rafah, and that the United States will lay out alternative strategies, military strategies, in talks with Israeli officials next week in Washington. Now, the question of a military necessity is a question of what perspective one chooses. From Israel's perspective, and that is the primary reason why Netanyahu wants an offensive in Rafah, is the fact that the Israelis believe that the Gaza-based Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, as well as the Gaza-based military leader, Mohammed Deif, are in tunnels under Rafah. And so far, we're in the 6th month of this war, and Israel does not have a lot to show for itself in terms of destroying Hamas. If anything, you look at the most recent Palestinian public opinion poll survey that was released in this week. Hamas is losing a degree of popularity both in the West Bank and in Gaza, but nonetheless, a majority of Gazans want to see Gaza return to Hamas rule.
Moving on to, a more international conflict, one out of the Middle East from a geographical point of view, but very much related to at least some countries in the Middle East, and that is the Russian-Ukraine conflict. When the West imposed sanctions on Russia's, financial system, well, Russia, of course, had to look for allies to manage their financial system. And one of those allies that remained an ally for a long, long time was the UAE. Now, weeks after the UAE was taken off the grey list of the Financial Action Task Force, Dubai's largest bank is implementing Western-style sanctions against Russia in a major blow to Russia's access to the international financial system. So what is this? The UAE finally, or at least one bank, at least in the UAE, attempting to play ball with the, with their Western counterparts against Russia?
Well, I'm not sure that I would describe the UAE as an ally of Russia. The UAE clearly has close ties with Russia and has been very cooperative in helping Russia in multiple ways. Now, what that did is two things. For the UAE, it was pure business opportunity, but it also was a way of signaling to the United States that the UAE has options, even if those options may be more limited than the UAE wants to admit. One of those ways in which the UAE was signaling was that the UAE was not bound, did not feel bound by U.S. and Western sanctions against Russia, particularly with regards to finance and banking. And so Russians could freely deposit money in UAE banks. UAE banks basically served as the bankers of companies that helped Russia circumvent the sanctions, and multiple Russians, huge numbers of Russians, saw Dubai as a safe haven as they left Russia. The UAE was on the Financial Action Task Force, which is the world's the international anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism finance watchdog, was on the task force's gray list, not just simply because of Russia, but because of multiple issues with regard to safeguards in the UAE against money laundering. And it was therefore put on the gray list. It was given some 41 recommendations that it needed to fulfill to get off the gray list, and that it recently achieved. What has now happened is that the UAE's or Dubai's largest bank, which is a government-controlled bank, the MBD, the National Bank of Dubai, has now basically closed down Russian accounts. It's closed down its department for Russian accounts. And that is a serious blow to Russia's access to the international finance system. Pardon me.
James, moving on to matters Saudi Arabia. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia, the 2034 World Cup, which is to be hosted in Saudi Arabia, human rights activists are concerned that if FIFA does not step in with some sort of a worker policy, it's going to be marred by deaths, ill treatment of workers, which we've seen in the Gulf for some time now. Even Qatar themselves have been accused of, worker deaths, mistreating workers as they built those massive stadiums to do their hosting, a year or two, back. Saudi Arabia, also with its dismal record of treating migrant labor, may fall in that very same category. What are we to make of these claims by the human rights organizations, and will FIFA take action against a current footballing juggernaut like Saudi Arabia?
Well, let's be frank about it. FIFA has never taken a real and strong stand, and under Gianni Infantino, it is unlikely to do so in the case of Saudi Arabia. Now, keep in mind that Saudi Arabia is the only bidder for the 2034 World Cup, but it has yet to be awarded the hosting rights. That will probably happen in November at a FIFA Congress in Bangkok. Migrant workers were certainly the initial focal point of the campaign to the human rights campaign to persuade the Qataris to improve the working and living conditions of migrant workers. In the case of Qatar, the focus or the example that was primarily used were Nepali workers. You now have a situation in which The Guardian, which was a leading newspaper in raising these issues with regard to Qatar, has now documented a similar situation with regard to Bangladeshi workers in Saudi Arabia. The issue, and based on that, human rights groups have taken their first shot across Saudi Arabia's bow by warning that unless FIFA this time around, from the beginning, insists on labor reform in Saudi Arabia, we may be facing the same sort of situation that we faced in Qatar. The problem, of course, is that Qatar saw an interest in working with human rights groups and trade unions to improve the working and living conditions of migrant workers. Saudi Arabia is less likely to be willing to engage with its critics and is going to prove to be a much tougher nut to crack.
James Dorsey, thank you for joining us on Radio Islam International this morning here, our second Friday in Ramadan. Thank you for your time, James, and have a good one ahead of you.
Ramadan Mubarak, and as always, I'm happy to have been with you today.